Welcome to Al Ginkgo, your virtual campfire talk with fellow eclectics kindling knowledge synthesis.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
And welcome to you, Brother Karim, and our dear listeners, and Ramadan Mubarak to all of you. I'm Dr. Omar Zaid, sitting here in the middle of Kentucky, and we are in now April of 2023, carrying on this conversation with Brother Abdul Karim in Kuala Lumpur. And we've been reviewing bits and pieces of Islamic history, particularly with regards to some of the errors which traditional Muslims have made and continue to make. And we're doing our best to indicate those errors and try to also indicate corrective measures. I'm doing this in conjunction with a few other people that I'm interviewing from time to time, somewhat on a weekly basis, otherwise not so infrequently. And we left off with maybe the idea that we would go into the Ottoman period, but I don't think we've really finished with the so-called Golden Age. I considered that, and I thought, well, there's probably many things we've skipped over, which can't be avoided. No one can cover everything in this great field of knowledge with regard to history and philosophical and religious ideations, which are associated with what we have called Islam and the Muslim community these last 1400 years. But before we go into the Ottoman period, which I guess reaches back some 500 years, let's dip back into the so-called Dark Ages, into the Renaissance from an Islamic perspective. And I'll just give you an example of some of one influential individual that I'd like you to just give an example from my knowledge, who influenced the Jewish movement, which has always influenced Muslims directly, surreptitiously, or otherwise. Politically, it doesn't make any difference. If we approach the Golden Age, we reach a fellow by the name of Maimonides, and he was a Jew, well-known Jewish scholar and father of what you might call modern Talmudism. Not that the Talmud didn't exist before then, but he put his imprimatur on the Talmud and also on the Kabbalah. The Kabbalah was pretty much, it had been written down, I think, 500 years previously as a result of Babylonian influences, which had been 1,000 years in the making. And up to that point, maybe to the time of Christ, when we think about people like Paul and his teacher, there was an oral Kabbalah, and it then went through this process of modification post the Alexandrian influence and post the Roman influence, which was this great lover of all religions, and finally made them all into what has become Catholicism and shades of all forms of Christianity to this date, which have influenced the Western world. But Maimonides influenced the Jewish world in a way that has not been widely acknowledged, with his imprimatur on certain aspects of the Talmud, the Zohar, and the Kabbalah. And one of those influences, what has come into modern day the world as Chabad, And Chabad has its origins in the Sabbatean movement. And the Sabbatean movement is this sort of 15th century Jewish Messiah. He wasn't the only one, but he was a major influence, which led to um, various kinds of movements in Europe and also out of Europe. In Greece, for example, you had Sabbateans in Greece, and they became the Donmei. And Sabbateans, they practice a peculiar approach to immorality, in that they sort of justified their position by saying that, well, you have to experience immorality. In other words, you have to actually participate in the evil in order to overcome it and then make yourself pious. So then you get people like Rasputin and so forth. And they say, oh, God lost himself, a piece of himself when he created man, and we've got to go redeem that piece. And you understand this. It's an incredibly bastardized and impious form of theology, but there are Jews who take it seriously. Now, the Sultan got a hold of this Sabbatean founder, and Shabbatai Zevi, I think his name was, and he became a Muslim ostensibly, and then his movement, in at least in the Middle East, became crypto Muslims, and they became the Donmei, and then out of that you get people like Ataturk, who then put the finishing touches on the British Zionist movement to overthrow the Ottoman Caliphate. And this happened just over 100 years ago. And many people don't understand or know these things or comprehend them. But in any case, that's the influence of just this one man, Maimonides, who also influenced the Khazars and told them, "Hey, look, you've got to when you become Jew and you want to overcome your enemies in the West and in there in Russia, you have to pretend to be like them. So you have to become priest, you have to become psychologist, you have to become all of the professors and pretend to be good Christians in order to subvert their cultures and subvert their politics, and then come uh, into dominion by pretending to be them. So this is a form of hypocrisy. Now, as we come out of the Dark Ages and into the Renaissance, and which spans this wonderful period called the Golden Age into Andalus and other aspects of Islam at that time, there must have been comparable Muslim movements who did two things. One, tried to subvert Islam, and two, tried to preserve it. And both of these were working both of these movements must have been working against the so-called traditional Sunni perspective, or even the traditional Shia perspective. You see, I know that there are Jews who remained in Babylon, remained in Persia, Iran to this day, Iraq, and they have served to subvert those communities, Christian, Muslim, it doesn't make any difference, to the best of their own benefits, which is what the Jews always do. You see, that's it's their cultural norm to subvert other cultures, rather than, if they cooperate, it's only to subvert them and to overcome them and to dominate them, except for a small section of truly mm, of genuine Jewish people who, for example, there's a small portion of them, 15 to 20,000 in the world, who don't go along with Zionism. Yes, you see, so this is a very small fragment of a 20 to 30 million Jewish global Jewish population. But what I'm trying to get at here is what kind of movements within Islam, within the Muslim Ummah, however fragmented it was never really a monolith. We understand that. Most people don't understand that. But Islam, the Muslim Ummah, was never a monolith. It maybe it may have pretended to be from time to time, but it was always fragmented because of this dynastic and influence and the constant political conflicts that took place. But there must have been religious movements that stemmed from the early Umayyad and Abbasid movements and then slowly changed in one way or form, one way or the other, into a continuation of the rational movements. I'm sure you can find some rationalists amongst the Sufis, for example, who try to do their best to overcome the legalist perspective of the traditional Sunnis and and rationally apply religion in in such a way that I'm sure that they were persecuted as well, you know. So the Sunnis and the Sufis never really got on. They're getting on now a little bit better than they have in the past. But if you look at some of the other populations, the more conservative, for example, in Arabia, they're still at great odds with the Sufis. But I'm not just concerned about Sufis. I'm sure there were other rational movements within Islam that tried to overcome the legalism of the traditionalist movement, which moved away from rationalism into a form of quiet tyranny, you know, that just all conform to get along for the sake of, you know, whoever the leader is, and let's maintain peace and order. And if we have to turn our back on truth, which is cowardice, you see. To do that, let's just do it. So I'm sure there were movements under the conventional facade of Islam that tried to their best to preserve rationalism and to preserve a, a, a reasonable approach to the Islamic perspective, which early rationalists tried to preserve, as we've discussed previously. So as you look at that period, going from, say, for example, the late 8th, 9th century into the 13th, 14th century, I know it's a large period. We're looking at maybe 700 years there. There must have been some movements, some socio-political enterprises that are not commonly spoken about at the minbars of today. You see, so this is what I'm trying to get at, brother. If you could shed some light on that for us and help to enlighten us on that part of the history of Islam, which is not really discussed as it should be, inshallah.
Yes, thank you, Brother Omar, once again for the opportunity to share some thoughts with you and your viewers. Yes, this is a very, very important question, and actually, it happens to be right at the center of my own research interest. So I will give it the best shot. But please
Very good.
remember, and I would like to mention to the viewers too, that for me, like I think just about for everybody else, this is work in progress. So I hope that you and the viewers will give me some slack if I get something wrong, that you you will give me some way of, I don't know whether I should say escape or whatever. Anyway, like I said, it's work in progress. So let me just begin by taking a few seconds to do my
Of
door.
course. Of course.
Right. So once again, perhaps I can begin by mentioning that this question in particular is quite interesting to me personally, because, as you know, I come from a background in philosophy, political philosophy, and I used to associate it with people that I prefer to refer to as the friends of Leo Strauss.
Hmm.
And the Leo Strauss himself actually was very interested in Maimonides, the fellow you mentioned earlier,
Hmm.
and also in Benedict Spinoza. Both of them were Jews.
Yes.
If I understand the work of Maimonides, and I think he was a doctor at the court of
Yes, he
the
was.
Spanish
Hmm.
Muslim caliphate, right? So he
Hmm.
was quite close to the ruler
Yes.
of Spain, the Muslim ruler of Spain. So good for him that he had good relations with them. And generally speaking, the Jewish people, I think, were treated quite well by the Muslims.
Yes, they
I mean,
were.
in most cases.
Never better.
So even better than the treatment they receive from, sad to say, some of the Christian communities. But anyway, however that may be, I think that if I understand it correctly, when Maimonides wrote his Guide for the Perplexed, he was trying to share some thoughts with some of his people, especially with those people who began perhaps to develop certain doubts about the Torah and whether they could wholeheartedly commit to it, because they began to notice, like Spinoza, did. They began to notice some discrepancies, in the Torah, and he wanted clarify and maybe remove these doubts, from their hearts and minds. And so I think he tried to assure them that, look, the Torah is still, it is a valid book, and these sort of areas of discomfort can be approached in this way, and this is how we can, remain faithful Jews and not drift from the Torah because of these seeming problematic passages, in the book. And Spinoza later on, Baruch Spinoza, in his theological political treatise. And by the way, Leo Strauss wrote his first book on Spinoza, Spinoza's Critique of Religion. So I think I read the book, and it's very worth reading. And I think Strauss also tried to, as it were, I could be wrong, of course. The friends of Leo Strauss perhaps are best left to speak for themselves. But as far as I understand, the purpose of the book, it was to offer a kind of defense of, Judaism or Torah in particular, and try to fend off some of the criticisms that Baruch Spinoza was leveling or raising, some doubts that he was raising about the Torah. And I recall, by the way, the book, Theological Political Treatise, and of course Strauss's book as well, are both very well written. They are both very clear writers, although Strauss mentioned that he, believes that, in this so-called esoteric writing, so you may need to look a little bit harder than you would. Perhaps he said that partly because of what happened to Spinoza after he wrote this treatise. You see, Spinoza, after this book became public, he was denounced by the Jewish community of his time and basically excommunicated. And you mentioned yourself that he was made to lie down at the door of the synagogue, and everybody stepped on him as they were going out, as a symbolic way of indicating that he is a very bad fellow, so to speak,
because
of what he. Because he created these doubts, you see,
yes,
by thinking about the Torah, you see. So here again, we see a sort of pressure from the community on people who could come across as dissidents. The pressure is not to think too much, or not to think so much, or don't try to be too rational or too rationalistic. You have to take things on faith, and we see it every day. I in fact see it even in our clubhouse discussions. One of the brothers even told us that when he popped into one of the Sunni rooms on Clubhouse, he was explicitly told, and this is a verbatim quotation, he was told, stop thinking. You see, he was explicitly asked to stop thinking. But of course, thinking, it's something difficult, for people to, especially people who enjoy thinking. So what I'm getting at with this is that, you see, at the bottom of this, all these, questions and issues, is the basic question is, what is the relationship between reason and revelation here? How do we, human beings who have been endowed with a rational faculty by Allah, how do we approach a text that presents itself to us as a revealed text, whether it is the Torah or the Injil or the Quran? What is the right way to do? And by the way, there's a fellow in the US, his name is Michael Sells. He has an interesting book on the subject. I think it's called Approaching the Quran. He was a professor at University of, I think, South Carolina, is it? At Chapel Hill. He got into a bit of trouble at one time because he was accused of proselytizing Islam among his students, but that case went up, I think, to the Supreme Court of the state, and it was found that he was not doing that, so he was cleared of these charges. But anyway, as you can see, a very sensitive question. So, this notion, it brings us back to this issue, this question, how exactly do we as rational human beings relate to a text that presents itself as revealed? And in this connection, I recall one video where Brother Yasir Qadi, mentions that the problem with the Muqtasim, so-called rationalists, was that and this is practically verbatim, he said I quote, they placed reason above revelation, end of quote. Now, what do we do with a statement like that? Well, perhaps some did place reason above revelation. Perhaps some of them did claim that reason can arrive at the same conclusions as we find in the Quran. I personally don't believe that, but then I don't believe the view of the other group at the other end of the spectrum, the Ash'arites, at least those who claim that human rationality outside of revelation can have nothing to say about ethics. I think that is plain wrong. Unfortunately, because we can deduce a system of ethics, for example, without reference to revelation, simply by looking at the consequences of different actions. If I, for example, began abusing drugs on myself, and then I ended up as a junkie and destroyed human beings because of my abuse of these substances, of course, you can draw a conclusion from that you should not, use intoxicants and don't abuse any substances, so that there's a moral lesson to be had. So I don't buy this argument by the traditionalists who are adamant who belittle reason to the point where they say not only that the reason cannot articulate any principles of ethics, and I would advise them to look at, for example, Aristotle's ethics. To me, they actually strikes me quite Islamic, because the basic principle of Aristotle was that, a virtue is found between two extremes. For example, who is a generous person? So it's one who neither spends too much or is not too stingy. The two extremes are, on the one hand, I hate to spend, I become like Scrooge, in Charles Dickens' story, or I become a spendthrift and then I go broke because I spent all my wealth. So he says that a generous man is the one who, stays in the middle. He follows the golden mean. That is the golden mean. And even our refers to the ummah, the Muslim ummah, as the ummatan wasatan. Interestingly, right in the middle of Surah Al-Baqarah in verse 143. So yes, we as Muslims are supposed to be the ummatan wasatan, the moderate, the middle ummah, the ummah of the golden mean, and this is also confirmed, for example, by Mustafa Akyol in his book called Islam Without Extremes. So now to come back to your question at the beginning, one of the questions was that, were there any groups in Islamic history that were, standing up for the cause of reason and rationality? Absolutely, definitely. And here I can once again recommend an article, in fact, written by Mustafa Akyol about early rationalists in Islamic history. I think you can Google it, find it online. I think it was published or is published on the website of the Cato Institute, where now he is, I think, a senior research fellow. And there he makes a very interesting point, and he helped to clarify some of the issues I myself have been struggling with, because when you read sort of neo-traditionalists like Taha Jabir al-Wani, whose work I really appreciate, and I build on it, and of course I have some differences. For example, he's almost completely silent about jihad. Why this deafening silence about jihad, especially jihad al-talab? Shouldn't we have analysis of that? But he does good work in other areas, like the relationship between Quran and Sunnah, the issue of apostasy and what have you. And he's particularly strong in his critique of taqlid and, trying to revive ijtihad and what have you. But when you look at analysis of what went wrong in early intellectual Islamic, early history. How do I put this? My goodness, early Islamic intellectual history. He uses the conceptual framework whereby he pits the rationalists on the one hand, and whom he calls the Ahlul al-Ra'i, the people of opinion. Although the word Ra'i, its root actually refers to seeing. He compares the people of opinion, or Ahlul al-Ra'i, to the Ahlul Hadith, who are the traditionists. So here we have a kind of a framework whereby there were two camps. And I think, roughly speaking, the Ahlul Ra'i, or the people of opinion, we can also designate them as the people of reason, because I don't think you can get arrive at an opinion without the use of reason, although I suppose you could simply adopt it without reflection. Anyway, the representative of the people of reason, the Ahlul Ra'i, I think would be Imam Abu Hanifa, and the adversary here, the representative of the Ahlul Hadith would be Imam al-Shafi. So, of course, Shafi lived after Abu Hanifa, but so they had this debate. The debate was partly about what is the best way to approach the Quran. Of course, the rationalists would argue that, well, you use your brain and you approach the Quran directly without the intermediation of tradition. Now here the Ahlul Sunnah or the Ahlul Hadith will say, no, that's not good enough. Why? Because reason, your akal, your intellect is unreliable. It is prone to be, they actually take a kind of a Freudian, or you might say almost, a view of the human psyche or soul, however you want to call it, psyche. As you could recall, Freud postulated basically that the id rules the person, and that the human reason, unlike what the Socratics used to argue, human reason is not in control, but emotions are in control. In particular, the sex drive, according to Sigmund Freud. Of course, I think they're wrong, but that's another issue. What I'm trying to highlight here is that the Ahlul Hadith also sort of downgraded reason as something unreliable, and that you're suggesting that when we say that we are using reason, we are actually following our desires, you see. So they even they even translated the word hawa, which means desire, in the Quran. And I discovered this when I was writing my paper on critical thinking, which has now been published. It's in the public domain. I think it's called Enhancing Critical Thinking Among Muslim Students in Institutions of Higher Learning. I discovered that the word hawa, which the traditionists render as capricious opinion, that is how they translate the word hawa.
Oh dear.
But when you look into
capricious,
when you look capricious, exactly, that's the key word. Underline that one.
I think the Stoics would have trouble with that.
Yeah. So an opinion, you see, because you need the akal, the intellect, to arrive at an opinion. But when I looked into the Hanswehr dictionary, along with a friend, a colleague whose Arabic was better than mine at the time anyway, we discovered that the word hawa, yes, it meant lust, it meant desire, it meant caprice, it meant impulse, but none of the word opinion was not among any of the connotations, you see. So the way the traditional ulama rendered the meaning of this word hawa, because we do have a passage in our Quran where Allah Ta'ala says, La tattabi'u ahwa'akum. That means do not follow your desires, or do not follow their desires. There's another expression. So the ulama have translated this to mean do not follow your capricious opinions, you see. They inserted that word opinion into the sentence, thereby effectively prohibiting people from expressing their opinion on the Quran, and thereby in a way monopolizing the discussion of the interpretation of the Quran among themselves, and preventing access of so-called lay people to the Quran. And we know that the traditional ulama actually openly, unabashedly tell people, if you try to read the Quran by yourself, Satan will be your guide. In other words, they always advise, always read the Quran with the help of some alim. Now they appoint an intermediary between you and Allah, and they're asking you to put your trust in the intermediary, while Allah Ta'ala in the Quran clearly says that, how does it go in Arabic? In Allah yuhibbul mutawakkilin. Allah loves those who put their trust in him, not the scholar or the Sahaba or any of the Imams, you see.
Yes.
So what I see here, as also Brother Omar Ramahi pointed out in his book, excellent book called Islam and the Muslim's Greatest Challenge, choosing between Islam and tradition, just published, I think, in 2019. He points
Oh,
out
that's
this.
very recent.
Yeah, very recent. He has a number of excellent videos, by the way, on YouTube. He points out how this anti-intellectual trend developed in early Islamic intellectual history, and I think it started with the people who wanted to basically discredit reason and rationality, and of course the rationalists themselves, by trying to make reason or the intellect appear weak and unreliable, and they have even produced some hadiths to that effect. These hadiths are, for example, quoted by Abdul Zaid in his book called The Quran and Introduction. And the hadiths basically say there are two of them, that according to the hadith, the Prophet allegedly said that anybody who expresses his opinion about the Quran, notice the word opinion again, has just booked for himself a place in hell. Even if it is a true opinion. In other words, even if you state the truth, you have still booked a place in hell for yourself. So you have this, but contrast this, for example, with Allah Ta'ala says about the reason and aql in the Quran. Of course, there are many places where Allah emphasizes rationality, or in the Quran, afala taqilun, tadabbur or meditation is also emphasized a great deal. Afala taqilun, mentioned already. And then we have verse 100 in Surah 10, which says that Allah will place ridges or abomination or confusion on the people who do not use their reason. Allah will place confusion on the people who do not use their reason. And I think that is exactly what happened. When the Muslims community, I mean the mainstream or the anti-rationalist part of the community, abandoned reason, it didn't take long for them to abandon the Quran also. And this is confirmed, almost all of it, and this is confirmed even by Sunni scholars, specifically by Taha Jabir al-Wani, who writes in his 2017 book, Reviving the Balance. The book was published a year after he passed away, may Allah bless his soul. He himself states that the Ummah abandoned the Quran almost entirely, end of quote. This is practically verbatim. And so then my explanation why they abandoned it is because they fell in love with the traditions. They became enchanted by the Sunnah, the Prophet, and the life of the Prophet. And also another reason, perhaps this was the first reason, that they reduced their reliance on their own reason. So the result of this, shying away from using our intellect to understand the Quran is going to be, I don't see how you can arrive at any other conclusion that I'm going to begin to misunderstand the Quran. How can I possibly understand anything of the Quran without using my brain? And I have seen it at the university. I tested one young person, asked this person to recite the Fatiha line by line. She could not translate a single line of the Fatiha. So I said to her, you mean you have been saying this for 17 times a day for how many years, and the thought never crossed your mind that you would like to know what it is that you are reading? So Quran illiteracy is a massive problem in the Muslim community. So like I said, so this is partly a result. Yeah, even today, absolutely.
Yes.
So just to sum up, one other group I haven't mentioned yet are the Ahlil, the Mutakallimun, the Ahlil Kalam. Sometimes they are known as the theologians. They are considered to be the precursors of the Mu'tazilites or the rationalists. The Mu'tazilites were known as the people of Tawhid and justice. Of course, they were also rationalists. So I would suggest that the Ahlil, sort of the Mutakallimun, Ahlil Kalam here stands for the Quran. So the Ahlil Kalam were in fact Ahlil Quran, you see. So the real debate back then was as much between the Ahlil Quran and the Ahlil Hadith as it was a debate between the Ahlil Al-Rai or the rationalists and the traditionists. So in fact, I've come to the point now that I basically classify these three groups as a single groups, of course, as with some differences. So the rationalists originally as they were represented by Abu Hanifa, but then he was later kind of the mazhab changed a little bit over time, but I would classify, at least initially, the followers of Abu Hanifa as rationalists, but also I would say that they had a great in common with the Ahlul Kalam. By the way, the Ahlul Kalam would not accept any hadith. They completely rejected hadith in total. Abu Hanifa, there's a small difference. He would accept some hadiths, but very few. The hadiths that he would accept were the so-called verbatim hadiths, and this is documented in a book by Daniel Brown, not Jonathan Brown, by the way. There are two different Browns. I recommend Daniel Brown. Jonathan Brown is another cup of tea, but let's leave that aside for now. Daniel Brown points out that, and by the way, he uses that dichotomy, Ahlul Quran versus Ahlul Hadith, which is in contrast to the dichotomy used by Tajabil al-Wani, which is the rationalists versus the Ahlul Hadith. So they both agreed that at one end of the spectrum, we have the Ahlul Hadith, but the other end of the spectrum, Taha Jabir al-Wani refers to these people as the rationalists, and Daniel Brown refers to them as Ahlul Quran. So we actually have to remind from time to time to some of our Sunni friends on Clubhouse when they tell us that we Quran-only people are doing bidah because there were never any Quran-only people in the early days. Well, my response to them is, brother, do you know who was the first Quran-only person? Do you know who that was? That was a very famous person. Do you know who I'm referring to? It was the Prophet himself. Didn't he follow the Quran? And didn't he followed only the Quran? So you see, there's so much. Did he follow Bukhari? Please tell me, or Tirmidhi, or Nasai, or any of those other. You are following Bukhari and Nasai and Tirmidhi, and you think you are following the Sunnah of the Prophet? Please think again.
Muhammad also, peace and blessings be upon him. He also knew something of the Torah, you see,
Of
and
course.
he then used this knowledge to convict the Jews who betrayed him. You see,
Yeah.
so
Some of
he
the Jews,
was,
they didn't all.
yeah, he was following not just Quran, but what the Quran came to confirm and to correct. You see,
Absolutely,
and
absolutely.
this is something that people forget and they don't think about. But let me turn your attention to, um, for example, Salahuddin Ayubi. He had a teacher, a mentor, and I don't recall his name, and the Arabic name is not going to stick with me anyway. But when he was asked after he um, defeated and cast the Fatimids out of Egypt, and they had to go their own separate seductive ways, um, becoming the assassins and whatever else. Then bled itself into the Shia movement, which was never Shiite to begin with, but it has become so. Salahuddin cast them out, and then he went about the business of cleansing Jerusalem of its invaders. And somebody asked him, we're praising him about, his prowess and his leadership and all this sort of thing. And he went on to say, no, don't thank me. He thank my teacher. You see, who was that teacher? Do you recall? And what kind of movement was he a part of? Because whatever Salahuddin did, it must have been an attempt to return to al-Islam as he understood the Prophet to have established. And that's what I'm trying to get at. There must have been thinkers like Salahuddin's mentor uh, who counseled him and advised him on what chess moves to make, as he was sorting out the Fatimids and sorting out the Syriac condition, and then onwards to Jerusalem. There must have been movements at that time that sort of led us forward then into the Renaissance and into what Islam was able to preserve of the ancient knowledge and act as a sort of midwife, you see, to preserve this knowledge and yet maintain itself. Because in order to preserve the knowledge of the ancient world, you had to use your mind. You couldn't just be a legalist. Most of the legalists I know, they're as far away from science as the East is from the West. And if we're looking at this particular period that I'm talking about, there were men of science there. There were men of science. They had to be rationalists, you see. And so, how were they reconciling rationalism and a rational approach to reading the book of creation, you see, which is what science is, with the Quranist perspective? And how are they opposing, you see, this legalist impression, which was moving further and further away as time goes on, especially after the time of what's his name? You come to me in a minute. After the time of the Sufi
Imam al-Ghazali.
persuasion, Ghazali, yeah. After Ghazali, I think Ghazali was misunderstood. I think he wasn't in, 100% a rationalist, but he certainly taught his students to preserve a certain amount of legalism for the people in the street. In other words, for the average street walking Muslim, the pedestrian, just like the Catholics did. You see, there's a catechism. You just give them the catechism. Don't allow them to think too much. Okay, but at the same time, there were these wonderful people of science, like Ibn Sina, and moving forward with the science and preserving what was left of, the wonderful library of the Alexandria, and moving it in so that Europe could have this Renaissance. If it wasn't for these people, Europe would never have had that Renaissance, you see. So there must have been rationalists there. And how did they organize themselves? I mean, did they all have to become sort of secretive alchemists in order to preserve their lives from the legalists who held the sword? I'm just trying to sort this out because I'm not the historian. I'm sure you understand more of what these dynamics were at the time, and that's what I'm trying to pull out of you for the sake of our listeners here, dear brother.
Yes, thank you. When you mentioned the story about Salahuddin, it reminded me of what sometimes transpires between me and my daughter. When I
Uh-huh.
sometimes bring her a gift or buy her something or do something, for which then she says, "Oh, thank you, Daddy." And so I normally respond to her, "Emily, don't thank me. Thank Allah.
Yes,
Give
yes.
thanks to Allah." You see. So I'm just wondering whether Salahuddin could have gone a step further and given credit to Allah rather than his teacher, unless he meant that his teacher was Allah himself.
No, no, he did mention a teacher. It just doesn't register with me, these names.
Right.
I can't
Now,
remember them. Yeah.
yeah. In relation to the other question, where did it sort of begin? I think it's the process of decline. Of course, you can trace it right back if you want to, even to the period of the righteous caliphs. Let me just, though, go to the time that the people who believed in freedom were persecuted by the Umayyads. There were two groups there already, you see. There were the people who believed in predestination. This was in the 600s. They believed in predestination. They did not believe in freedom of the will. Then there were the Qadarites, who were the people who believed in the freedom of the will. Now, the Umayyad caliphs felt threatened by the doctrine, by the teaching that people have freedom to choose. So they
Hmm.
supported the Jabarites, which were, I think, the precursors of the Ahlul Hadith, because
Hmm.
most of the Ahlul Hadith later on, including Imam al-Ghazali, by the way, accepted the doctrine of predestination on the basis of their rejection of causality. Imam al-Ghazali rejected, these intermediate causes, and he basically says Allah is the cause of everything. So,
Yes.
meaning even if I commit a crime, Allah predestined me to commit this crime, which is, I think, complete nonsense. I don't know how we
Yes.
came to this opinion. And it
Yes.
has done tremendous damage to the Ummah. It demoralized the Ummah tremendously. And it's one of the biggest problems in so-called Aqidah of the Muslims. You see, the belief system was very seriously corrupted with the adoption of the doctrine of predestination. Dr. Omar Ramahi has an excellent video on it on YouTube. Is there predestination in Islam? And he shows how, this qada and qadar was added on to as a pillar of iman, despite the fact that verse 177 of Surah Al-Baqarah makes absolutely no mention of it. He traces this notion of predestination to a couple of hadiths, I think one in Sahih Muslim and the other one in Bukhari. But anyway, what I'm trying to say that the tension that the two camps, there were already two camps very early, of course, apart from the camps of what later became the Sunnis and the Shia, and those fratricidal wars. The first fitna and what have you, the Battle of the Camel and the Battle of Siffin and the other fitnas. Apart from those differences and tensions, which were very political, there were, of course, also these intellectual tensions, but they also had a political manifestation. And a proof of that is, for example, the beheading of the leader of the Qadarites by Marwan, one of the caliphs. And the person who was beheaded, the leader of the Qadarites was a fellow called Mabad al-Juhani. And this professor from Pakistan, his name is Pervez Hoodboy, does an excellent job in explaining the persecution of the rationalists by the traditionalists in a book called Islam and Science, which is accessible online in PDF format. And it's not a very big book. So this struggle between the people who believed in freedom and the people who believed in predestination kind of morphed into a tension or a conflict, if you like, or a clash between what we call now the rationalists or the Ahlul Quran. I kind of put them in the same basket, so almost with some minor differences, on the one hand, and the Ahlul Hadith, you see. And this carried on, and the Mu'tazilites also belong to this group. So now, yes, the rationalists had to escape and protect themselves. I
Yes.
think that book, Islam and Science, Pervez Hoodboy gives an example. I think it was it Al-Kindi who aroused some ire among the military who came after him into his house. Luckily, a friend warned him, so he escaped from his house. They didn't catch him, and he took refuge, inside in a friend's house, and they basically ransacked his house, and then there were others whose books were burned. They were chased out. Even Ibn Rushd, who is known as a rationalist, basically in Spain, he also was chased out, and of course Ibn Sina also experienced difficulties. One of the scientists was hit over the head with one of his books so hard that he lost eyesight in one of his eyes. And of course we also know that in 786 Musa al-Hadi committed the massacre of rationalists when 5,000 philosophers were executed for the crime of basically thinking. So under the Umayyads, the crime was believing in freedom. Under the Abbasids, the crime was believing in being a thinker, and not just any kind of thinker. The Abbasids did not leave out freedom that the Umayyads would persecute, because the Umayyads felt threatened. They thought if the people begin to get the notion that they have a freedom of the will, they may decide to change us as their government, you see.
Yes.
So the Abbasids basically condemned the so-called zindiqs, or people who are known as the free thinkers, you see. So a free thinker is, you have both concepts there. You have the concept of freedom and you have the concept of thinking. So both freedom and thinking became crimes, according to Musa al-Hadi. This persecution of thinkers took place in 786, as I said. It's documented in a book published by Oxford University Press, edited by Charles Kurtzman. The book is called Modernist Islam, and the reference is to an article by Jamaluddin al-Afghani, where he refers to this incident, quoting Suyuti, who was among the people who highlighted that this incident, this mass murder of scientists and philosophers for the crime of being basically free thinkers. So what we are witnessing here, if I understand what is happening here correctly, is a kind of rise of despotism.
Hmm.
Maybe we can use the word fascism.
Yes.
Some people use even stronger words. So because we see an erosion of thinking, of freedom and thinking. You see, these are
Hmm.
pillars uh, these two concepts, freedom and thought, are very strongly emphasized in the Quran, but there's almost no emphasis for them in the Hadith. Take Bukhari, for example. You will find 98 hadiths that will tell you where to place your hands when you are praying, but you will not find a single book on freedom, and you will not
Hmm.
find a single book on reason. And if while I'm at it, I may also add, you will not find any book on justice, and you will not find any book on ethics, and you will not find any book on human rights. What you find in Bukhari is a very stripped down version of Islam. I sometimes think of it as a caricature, you see, of Islam.
Hmm.
It is very different from the Islam that you find in the Quran. And this is the big tragedy, I think, in Islamic history, that the Ummah appears to have turned, by and large, from the Book of Allah, which is the revealed book, Word of God, to the books of the traditions, which are the words of human beings and which narrate the ways of their predecessors. So this was a kind of how do I put it? Taha Jabir al-Wani even referred to taqlid, following the predecessors, as a form of dalala, deviation,
Yes.
you see. And I
Yes.
remember when I had that quotation in my paper, one of my papers, my boss at the time, when he saw it, he says, no, it's not like that at all. So I think I mentioned this before. I took that word out, but I kept the rest of the quotation. I just put 3 dots there instead.
Hmm.
So, did some kind of a deviation take place? Let's pick up on Taha Jabir al-Wani's argument. Did the Ummah deviate from the Quran to the Hadith? Did this happen or not? Well, according to Taha Jabir al-Wani, who is a Sunni scholar, by the way, he's known as a neo-traditionist. The Ummah didn't only abandon the Quran. After a while, they even abandoned the Sunnah. By the
Hmm.
way, the rationale given for abandoning the Quran was that, well, the Sunnah includes the Quran anyway, so we don't need to refer to the Quran. And then after a while, they even threw the Sunnah under the bus, so to speak.
Hmm.
There was a second turn when they turned from the Sunnah to the work of the scholars, you see, the ulama. They became
Hmm.
their ultimate authority, as
Hmm.
Esposito puts it in one of his papers. I quote, Ijma overrules everything. So now the
Okay.
consensus of the scholars ends up to be the highest authority, followed by the Sunnah, and the Book of Allah ends up in third place. Now, what do you make of that? I think
Well,
this is highly
yeah.
problematic.
Yes. It brings to mind something that happened, as I'm informed, by a third party whom I've been in correspondence with some years ago. I've lost track of him now, but his name was John Quincy Triplett from West Virginia, who claims to be a member of the true Freemasonic party, if you will. And this has nothing to do with the Freemasons that we understand today, but rather of the old guild builders, the real stonemasons, the architects. And he claims that even Prophet Isa's family was of this fellowship, you see, that they were architects and builders. They've reduced it to carpentry, but it's a little bit more substantial than that. And I can I can attest to that because I was involved years ago in construction, and I have some people doing some work here for my wife here on the farm, and they're very, very profoundly involved in knowledgeable skills. Now, Mr. Triplett informed me that his group stems from a group of Knights Templars who were defeated by Salahuddin at one point, and then befriended, and then converted, you see. So not all of the Knights Templars converted. Those who did not convert to Islam became the Knights of Malta, according to his oral tradition. It's handed to him these last 800 years or so, father to son, father to son. And so he's keeping the record here, the memory stick, if you will, up there in the mountains of West Virginia. And he corresponded with me because of I often wrote about Freemasonry. And he said, look, here's an aspect you don't know. He said, this group was infiltrated and then corrupted during the time of the Illuminati. We're going back 200, 250 years ago. And we have no part of them. Matter of fact, we fought with them for the sake of, now I'm going to use your words, liberty and freedom. Now, let me take this back to the court of Salahuddin, who embraced these men, okay, and these Knights Templars who became Muslim in his presence. He gave them two of his daughters in marriage and maybe 10 or 12 nieces. They married these Templars, and according to Mr. Triplett's testimony, in other words, this is a oral history, father to son for the last 800 years. According to this oral history, Salahuddin charged them to fight for the sake of freedom and liberty and take it to the West along with their Islam. You see?
That's impressive.
Now, this is something that is not widely known. Okay, now I could tell you more about this history, but I don't want to go into. See, I'm trying to bridge the gap of knowledge here historically between the Umayyads, the Abbasids, and now the Ayyubis. You see and then what happened afterwards? Who carried this forward? There were societies like this, and I'm sure that there were societies amongst the Sufis who tried to do something similar in an uncorrupt fashion, but in a morally and ethically pure fashion. You see, to fight against the dynasties. Now I know Salahuddin handed his crown to, his son, but I'm sure he understood that this was not the way. But when you're in the middle of this kind of conflict at that particular political level, you can't really change it, you see. So how are you going to, and if you realize, okay, well, um, we've got to throw off the fetters, but they're going to come back on. So how am I going to preserve, and who's going to preserve it? And what better way to do it than to offer Islam to these wonderfully brave men, you see, whom he honored as warriors, who were amongst the greatest soldiers he had to confront on the battlefield, you see. And so they accept Islam, and then he charges him to carry the women. All right, now the women, you see, are those who nurture and they preserve the seed. They give birth to the seed, and then they bear the fruit. You see, so this whole thing goes forward and then westward. You see, I know it's all been buried in the muck of rewritten history, but I'm trying to get at the core, the archetypal core of what our prophet, our beloved prophet, established and who was responsible for carrying that forward. Because it certainly wasn't the traditionalist, you see. They did not carry this forward. They're the ones who established false records, false hadith, and false confessions and apologies for oppressive dynasties, who then forced the people to accept a sort of futile fatalism as an apology for predestination. Well, this completely overrides reason, you see. And so here I'm saying, well, Salahuddin handed a portion of Islam to these men from the West and said, please, you are rationalists, you are soldiers, you are warriors. Please carry this forward, carry it in the West. I'm not going to be able to. I've got to fight these fools. See, I have to fight these stupid fools. and I'm going to be too busy to try and preserve this. But you can take my women, take my daughters, take my nieces, take the seed of Islam and take it to the West. Now they did this. Mr. Triplett said they did it, and they did their very best. They did their very best to preserve it as Muslims on American territory, in the presence of men like George Washington, who was one of their brothers, you see, at the time. These are the very same men that manufactured the rifles that allowed him to win the Revolutionary War against Britain, who by that time were already British Zionists, you see. So this is an interesting connection. Now, if you've read any of my books, you know I wrote this little book called the Forgotten Saints, which on the Gospel of Barnabas, and that builds a bridge between Isa and what became the time of Islam's inception through Muhammad, you see, and the restitution of the kingdom of God, which Isa said is coming. It's at hand. Wait for him. He's coming. His name is Ahmad. He announced it to all of Jerusalem, you see. And so those people who accepted Muhammad, they were disciples of Isa who were waiting for him. They knew he was coming. That's why there were certain amongst the Christians, so-called Christians, who did not accept the divinity of Christ, who recognized Muhammad when he came, because they understood he was coming, and they were given certain intimations of whatever the prophetic signs were going to be, you see. So they confirmed him, and Khadijah was amongst their fellows. Khadijah was one of them, you see. That's why she knew who he was, you see. And she not only wifed him, she mothered him. I mean, she was 25 years, well, yeah, almost 20 years older than him, whatever the case might be. So, in a certain sense, he kind of married his mother. So, it was a good thing she didn't breastfeed him, you see, when he was coming up. So, I said, well, I said that because I'm interested in building these bridges, these historical bridges that bear the archetype of the truth and the people who carried this truth and fought and gave their lives for it amongst these rationalists. And all of these rationalists who gave their life for it, they were all men and women of science. They were all men and women of science. And you can the bricklayer is a scientist. There's a science. There's an art to it. You see, you don't just get up and build a bridge. You got to know how to do it. You have to understand the mathematics involved. You can't just be somebody who kisses the rug 5 times a day and waits for your flying carpet while you're reciting, Alhamdulillah 30,000 times. That doesn't work. I'm talking about the men and the women who had to, from time to time, hide themselves in order to preserve the truth, just like Muhammad had to be hidden in the cave as the spider wove his web over it to preserve his life from those who would take it unjustly. So that's what I'm trying to get out of here, uh, because I'm sure that you have some knowledge of people in movement like this, especially those who followed in the wake of Al Ghazali and the mess that he left behind, or the mess that disciples left behind when they misinterpreted perhaps some of the things he might have had to say. Somebody amongst these group of men and women carried the truth forward underneath all of the corruption, underneath all of the tradition, and underneath all of the false hadith. They had to hide it, they had to carry it forward, they had to preserve it somehow. So perhaps when next we meet next week, inshallah, you could between now and then give this some thought and try and pull out of your vast historical knowledge and socio-political purview of this period, you see, that brings us up to the Ottoman uh, mess, you see. Um, who were these people? How do you think you can recognize them? How can we recognize them for the sake of our students who have been kept away from this knowledge? I mean, certainly it's not an accident, you see, that someone like Johnny Triplett would contact me while I'm still in Kuala Lumpur. I had these conversations with him almost 10 years ago now. For a period of 2 years we corresponded, and I'm reviewing that correspondence now for the sake of other purposes in my life. So I'm asking you, dear brother, to review your own correspondence with that historical period and look for these people. Ask Allah to show them to you so you can pull them out of that history and show them to us in whatever way is possible. Because there is a stream, it's under the facade of the history that was handed to us and to our students. And I'm trying to my best to find it and to deliver it in a way that's comprehensible uh, for the sake of those students, so that they can also carry this forward to the next generation, to their children and grandchildren, especially in this time when everything's confronted with such fitna. So, inshallah, brother, please give
Inshallah.
that some thought.
Yeah, I will, inshallah. Thanks for the suggestions. Yeah, I will give it some thought. In fact, I have been giving it some thought, but that's a good question, because the question of what the period between Al Ghazali and Muhammad Abdu, yes, I think we need to see if there were any rationalists there, because
Yes,
so
of
far I
course.
haven't. But I'll have a look. Maybe I didn't overturn enough stones, so to speak.
Okay, I'm gonna
At
I'm
this,
gonna send you back to the riverbank. Make you go look at these stones and turn them over. Mud and
but
all.
this time I'm hoping to find something good rather than the other stuff.
Inshallah. So, with that having
Inshallah.
been said, brother, thank you once again for
My pleasure.
sharing your knowledge with us. And
And
I'll
thank you for
say,
having me.
wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Until next week.
Wa
Inshallah.
Walaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.